Group C Sportscar racing. A golden age for power, speed, and automotive innovation. But towards the end of Group C's decade in the limelight, things began to change, and not for the better. Mercedes, champions in 1989 with the rocket ship Sauber-Mercedes C9, faced the challenge not only of defending their crown, but navigating the toxic politics away from the track. This is the story of how they did it. Brought to you by Car Vertical. Sauber had been competing in the World Sports Car Championship since before the introduction of the Group C rules in 1982. They had varying results, using engines from whoever they could. They ran BMW engines, Cosworth engines, and eventually they found a more stable partner in Mercedes. Their first car built as partners, the C8, made its racing debut in 1985. And it was not the silver bullet that both companies had surely hoped it would be. The car managed a single victory in 1986, but they knew changes would need to be made if competing at the front of the grid was to become a regular occurrence. In 1987, they wheeled out the Sauber-Mercedes C9, a car I've made a whole video about before, so I won't repeat myself too much. The C9 wasn't immediately successful, but with a 5-litre twin-turbocharged V8 courtesy of Mercedes and Sauber's extensive chassis building knowledge, it was only a matter of time before the car found its way to the front of the grid. It became not just one of the fastest Group C cars, but one of the fastest racing cars ever put to track, dominating the 1989 season and taking victory at the historic 24 Hours of Le Mans. The kind of event you'd want to drive home from in absolute luxury.
Dennis, I want to go home now.
A Mercedes S-Class perhaps, though not this one. Thanks to Car Vertical, I can see that this car has had its mileage rolled back significantly. You can check to see if your car or one you want to buy has been crashed, stolen, or misrepresented by a seller like this dodgy S600 at the link in the description below. Car Vertical can show you the hidden history of a car and help you potentially avoid huge bills on a car you don't know the full story of. By going to the link in the description, you can get 10% off your next vehicle history check, or you can use the discount code automobilistic. Thanks to Car Vertical for sponsoring this video, and now back to the story of the Sauber-Mercedes C11. Success is a dual-edged blade. The Sauber-Mercedes team now faced the prospect of having to follow up their biggest hit. The C9 wouldn't cut the mustard. They knew Jaguar were hot on their heels, so development of a brand new car was the only way forward. But this was no normal development process. See, there was a rule change coming in 1991. Group C1, the higher tier of the Group C formula, would be moving to much stricter engine regulations for the 1991 season. The extremely controversial changes would see the cars forced to adopt 3.5-litre F1 style engines. This left manufacturers in a tough spot, because the reality was that for 1990, before the rule changes, running a 3.5-litre engine would be prohibitively expensive and probably not actually very competitive. Mercedes' solution? Develop two cars. The 1990 Sauber-Mercedes C11. They skipped C10 apparently because it's hard to say in German. C10. I guess it's harder than C11. Would be developed simultaneously, while a car for 1991, named the C291, would be developed too. On a side note, if C10 was too hard to say, why on earth did they decide to name the car that came after it the C291? Anyone's guess, really. Anyway, tangent aside, both these new cars would be built by Sauber, the biggest difference being the engine. The 730 horsepower, 5-litre twin-turbocharged V8 from the Sauber C9 would be carried over into the C11, who was capable of much more power unrestricted as well. Whereas the C291, built for the 3.5-litre rules, would have a brand new engine put into it, developed just for the car. Other than the engine, the C11 shared very little with the C9. Where the C9 had been built around a predominantly aluminium chassis, the new C11 was built around a much more technically advanced Kevlar and carbon fibre composite chassis. This had the result of making the C11 significantly lighter than the C9 and significantly more rigid. The C11 was so light in fact it had to take on board a significant amount of ballast to meet the 900 kg minimum class weight limit. It was surely a recipe for success. The car could generate around 20% more downforce than the outgoing Sauber C9 thanks to a ground-up aerodynamic redesign. And unlike its predecessor, the C11 wouldn't be contesting Le Mans in 1990 due to the fact it didn't count towards championship points that year. As such, the C11 was built without regard for having to install a low downforce kit used to help reach higher speeds on the Mulsanne straight. The car was tested in late 1989 before its true debut at Suzuka in 1990, though that debut didn't exactly go to plan. The team got to Suzuka, the first race of the 1990 season, and driver Jean-Louis Schlesser crashed in practice, damaging the car so badly they had to revert to using C9s in the race. A race that they actually won anyway, even with the older car. Only up from there, right? Monza was the new C11's true debut, and this time nothing got in the way. The cars qualified first and second, with the leading car of Mauro Baldi qualifying 2 seconds faster than the closest non-Mercedes car. That is an enormous margin. The cars went on to score a 1-2 finish, cementing themselves as the frontrunners for the 1990 season and confirming Jaguar's worst fears. The following race was at Silverstone, and after the domination that the C11s had shown in Italy, the expectation was that it would be the same again. It would be a predictable race result. But things began to go wrong for Mercedes. For starters, they were going to have to contest the race a car down. The second car, driven by Jochen Mass and Michael Schumacher, yes, the Michael Schumacher, had been disqualified after a dodgy practice session. Unfortunately, the remaining car suffered the worst possible fate given the circumstances, an engine failure. Classic really, when they needed it most, it bricked itself. Silverstone was won by the still-cut Jaguar team, in the hands of another name you might recognise from Formula 1, Martin Brundle. But Jaguar's time at the top of the podium was short-lived. All of the remaining 6 races were won by the Sauber-Mercedes C11, handing the team a decisive Manufacturers' Championship victory, and Mercedes drivers Jean-Louis Schlesser and Mauro Baldi taking joint first place in the Drivers' Championship, with Jochen Mass in second, and Mercedes drivers Karl Wendlinger and Michael Schumacher coming home a joint 4th in the Drivers' Championship. Mercedes finished the season with more than double Jaguar's points. On a quick side note, Michael Schumacher was only 21 when driving for the Mercedes WSC program in 1990. He only competed in 3 races and managed to win the final race of the season in Mexico where the leading Mercedes had been disqualified. While it was kind of unusual for open-wheel drivers to compete in endurance on their way up to Formula 1, the huge popularity of the World Sportscar Championship and Schumacher's excellent performance at the time helped boost his profile as a racing driver who would of course go on to become one of the greatest of all time. For 1991, the controversial 3.5-litre formula was pushed on to the World Sportscar Championship, more specifically its top class, C1. Older, non-conforming C1 cars that didn't meet the new engine requirements could contest a lower C2 class with heavy restrictions. Or in the case of the Mazda 787B, no restrictions at all, due to the fact it hadn't contested C1 previously and was the only car to have been classified as C2 both before and after the rule change. That's a whole can of worms in and of itself, luckily I've made a video about it before. As for Mercedes though, their C291, built specifically for the new engine rules, which were basically the same as Formula 1's engine rules at the time, was eligible for the top C1 class. The small displacement of the engines and the fact they had to be naturally aspirated was a headache for the Mercedes team, who had become accustomed to the enormous and easy power of their 5-litre twin-turbocharged V8. In preparation for the rule change, Mercedes developed a brand new engine for the car, a 3.5-litre naturally aspirated flat 12. This was in contrast to Jaguar, who had sourced an existing engine from the Benetton F1 team, a Ford 3.5-litre V8, and Peugeot, who had built a V10. There was only one way to see who had made the right call. Mercedes was not the winner of that particular battle of ideas. The C291 was plagued with reliability issues right from the start. To extract any power out of the minuscule cylinders, the engine had to rev extraordinarily high. This high-strung power plant proved deeply unreliable and became an enormous headache for a manufacturer trying to defend a winning streak. They knew that the C291 would have problems, and so to try and collect some points, they would run the car at the start of the season alongside an old C11. This proved to be a good call, as the C291 failed to finish the first 2 races of the season, races in which the restricted C11 managed 2 podiums. At the 3rd race of the season at Silverstone, the C291 managed its first confidence-inspiring performance, finishing 2nd place behind Jaguar, but crucially, for the first time, outperforming the car that it replaced. Despite this performance though, the team decided the C291 was guaranteed not to finish at Le Mans, and so they just simply didn't bother campaigning it at all. The Mercedes Le Mans effort was made up entirely of C11s that year, all of which were beaten roundly by the Mazda 787B. Mercedes had taken the interim period to try and work out all of the kinks with the C291, with the hopes of it being more competitive in the latter half of the season. They were confident enough that they removed the training wheels and ditched the C11 once and for all, betting the house on the C291. This was the wrong decision. Immediately, the C291 went on a streak of 3 DNFs, much to the despair of the team. They did manage to salvage 1 race win though, right at the very end of the season, with Michael Schumacher winning the final round at Autopolis, ending a terrible year for Mercedes on one high. 1991 was Jaguar's year, with the silk-cut Jaguar team claiming Constructors' and Drivers' Championship victory thanks to the XJR-14. Mercedes had been developing an evolution of the C291 for 1992 called the C292, but they felt the writing was on the wall for the WSC, and so the project was canned, paving the way for Group C's last hurrah with the Peugeot 905, a car you can hear the full story of here. Thanks for watching.